Welcome back, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for the Accessible and Inclusive Design Conference produced by the Training, Learning, and Development community. I'm glad you're here to join us. Let me take a look at chat and see. Yes, Christina saying hi, Gwen. Christina Pringy. And let me take a look. Yes, the room is filling up nicely. Looks like everybody's joining us now. Thanks, everyone. Gwen, Navarrete, Klapperich, you have done a number of sessions for TLDC in the past, and I'm so glad that you're here once again for our AIDC event. I really, really appreciate your participation every time. And you're also going to be on the Thursday panel too, and that one is going to be hosted by Kayleen Holt. And so let me read your bio real quick. I just have something quick that I'm going to read off so to introduce everybody to you. Gwen is the Chief Learning Consultant of Kita Consulting, LLC, a talent development consulting firm that specializes in employee training and development, diversity and inclusion initiatives, performance consulting, health and safety training. Gwen holds over 20 years of experience in training and development, customer service, supervision, and quality assurance initiatives, and has worked in various industries such as retail, call centers, healthcare, government, hospitality, nonprofits, and continuing education. So much. Gwen is also up very early in the morning because she is on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And so it's just past 7 a.m. there. So Gwen, thanks for making time for us today and joining us. I am especially interested in hearing what you have to say about your session. It's called Deliver Inclusive and Accessible In-Person Training, because I know that so many of us are getting back into that in-person thing post-pandemic. Anyway, as we're dealing with the pandemic and in these stages. So I'm very grateful for this timely presentation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hide myself from the stage and let you take over.
Hello, everybody. Aloha. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I will go ahead and share my screen. And if you could just give me 1 second here. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so here we go. And I want to share. Give me 1 second. I totally hear you, Bella. Every time I do this, I feel like a newbie. Here we go. All right. So thank you for coming. Just a visual description of myself. I am a Filipino woman with black hair and glasses, and I am wearing a black dress with a red sweater. And it's early in the morning here in Oahu, so bear with me, but thank you so much for coming. I'm going to talk about inclusive and accessible in-person training. There is going to be a little bit of overlap with some of the other sessions that you'll be attending, but I will try to keep this as unique to in-person training as much as possible. Okay. So one of the tools that I like to use in my in-person classes is Microsoft Translator. Now, for those of you who speak these other languages, I do apologize if they are incorrect. I do use Microsoft Translator, though, because for me, when I have people in my classes who speak other languages other than English, it does help to bridge that communication gap a little bit. So if you're curious to see what it looks like, go ahead and scan that QR code. And you can pull up in any different language you want. I'm going to be speaking in English, but if you would like to hear the presentation or look at the presentation in another language, or if you would rather see the closed captioning on your phone rather than on AirMeet, that will be available to you. So I'll give it a couple of seconds for those of you who wish to scan the QR code. And thank you, Amy. Yes, we are safe. I am on Oahu, so we do. We're not far. We're not close to the fires at all, but we are having a lot of people evacuate from Maui to Oahu. So I do appreciate everybody's concern. Thank you so much. Okay. So I want you to picture this for a second. So a couple of years ago, I was training a class, and this just happened to be in the Philippines. And a woman approached me and she said, I'm a little scared because I can't see very well. And I know that you have a lot of pictures and a lot of slides. And I am afraid to tell my employer that I can't see because I don't want to lose my job. Now, I wasn't really prepared for this. I don't know if anybody else has encountered this in their in person classes when they do training and development, but this was something that kind of took me by surprise. On another occasion, I had a gentleman approach me in the middle of a training, and it was here in Hawaii, and it was a very kind of text heavy course. It was a certification course, so it was very text heavy, and it required a certification exam. And he approached me and he says, I can't lose my job, but I don't know if I'm going to pass this certification exam because I can't read. Now, in either of those situations, go ahead and put it in the chat. Would you know what to do? Or if you do know what you would do, what would you do? So would you know what to do? And if you do know what to do, what would you do? Offer reassurance and alternative to meet needs. Yeah. Try to work with the individual. Consult with my manager. Follow up in real time. Okay. Instinct would be to work with each person individually to help meet their needs. Yeah. So that is actually what I ended up doing was I worked with each individual to meet their needs. But it kind of got me thinking that, a lot of times when we talk about accessibility, we talk about Section 508, we talk about WCAG, we talk about e-learning in asynchronous format. But what about our in-person classes? What about our virtual training classes? Now, today I'm going to concentrate specifically on in-person classes because there is another session on virtual training. But yeah, you try to accommodate as quickly as possible, call around for resources, try to do what you can. But what would happen if you knew to expect this or you anticipated this before you actually stepped into that classroom? Now, before we move on, I do want to have a little bit of a disclaimer here. Unlike some of you, I'm not an accessibility expert. I am still learning. These are just some of the things that I have picked up on my journey over the last couple of years, specifically in an in-person training environment. So I still occasionally make mistakes. I've done my best to make these materials as accessible as possible. But if you see something that is not accessible, then please let me know. I'll do my best to fix it. But again, I'm in the process of studying for that certification exam from the International Accessibility. I forgot their IIAP organization, but I am not an accessibility expert by any means. These are just some of the things that I've picked up over the years of the tools and the tricks in anticipating of what people may encounter. So let's chat. When should we start considering inclusion and accessibility during our training, design, and delivery process? Yeah, okay. At the very start, during the development, right away, as early as possible in the analysis phase. Yeah. So absolutely, you want to think about it from the very beginning. And for those of you who are on LinkedIn, there is a gentleman by the name of Cam Boydwan, and I'm going to go ahead and put his name in the chat. He actually is an accessibility expert and an accessibility consultant, and he likens accessibility to eggs in a cake. So what happens if you forget to put the eggs in a cake when you bake it? Thank you, Bella. Use flaxseed. Okay. So, but eggs are really the binder of a cake. So sometimes if the recipe calls for, yeah, it tastes terrible, the cake doesn't turn out, it doesn't bind. So if the cake calls for eggs instead of a substitution, it won't bind as well. Accessibility is kind of like that. If you don't put it in the process ahead of time, then you're spending more time trying to fix it, or you're trying to scrap things at the very beginning, or you're running around last minute trying to figure out how you can accommodate something that comes up that you didn't anticipate, right? So we do want to incorporate that at the very beginning of the design process, even before we consider delivery. Now I'm going to go into what I do in my classes before, during, and after training. So before training, one of the very first things that I do, and I have a checklist, but I purposely made this slide inaccessible because I want to see what is on this slide that is inaccessible to you. So, I mean, this is a typical slide that you can do with Microsoft Designer on PowerPoint. And as you can see, it comes up and it's pretty inaccessible. But the text is too small, the contrast, what else is, yeah, not enough contrast, text too small, color contrast, yeah. So they hurt, right? So we just need to be aware of some of these things. Sometimes the tools that we use to make things appealing, they may be inadvertently inaccessible on some level. Now, there are options out there. So this is the same exact slide. I know it's got a lot of text on it, but I will make these slides available to you afterwards. I'll give you a link so that you can download them if you would like. But basically, this is the same exact slide, just a little bit more clear. And it does have a little bit of design process to it. So it's not to say that your design slides need to be a little bit plain, but they do need to be accessible in some place. Yes, they need to be simpler. So I'll just go through some of the things that I do before I go into a training classroom. And sometimes I don't have the luxury of knowing what that room is going to look like ahead of time. But what I do like to do is I need to know what the accessibility capabilities are of that venue. So for example, are there accessible bathrooms, which should be a default by now, right? Where are they located? I do like to ask ahead of time what accommodations are needed, and I give a due date because some of the required accommodations, like ASL interpretation or CART, which is captioning or accessible in real time, so it's close captioning with a real person, that does take time to arrange for. So I like to give a due date to say, please let me know by this date what accommodations you need in my classroom so that I can arrange them for you. I do make sure that I send out the materials ahead of time so that people with cognitive disabilities or people with screen readers can review the materials ahead of time and that they're able to participate a little bit more fully when they come to class. Also like to arrange for videos to have a transcript or audio descriptions. And then if I do need to arrange for things like live captioning or ASL, I do like to meet with the interpreters ahead of time so that they are aware of the materials that are coming out. And as much as possible, I like to use local service providers because they're familiar with the regional vernacular and the regional dialect. So for example, here in Hawaii, we have certain lingo that we use or certain vocabulary that we use in certain places that would not be understandable by, let's say, a CART provider on the continent. So we try to use as many local providers as we can. Yeah, thank you, Galib. The color contrast is actually, there's a lot of color contrast checkers out there that you can use, and it's very helpful to use that. Now, as far as PowerPoint is concerned, for those of you who are not aware, there are accessibility templates that you can use. You just type in accessible or accessibility, and it pops up all the accessibility templates in all programs. I do find that to be very useful. Microsoft also does have an accessibility checker. It's not perfect by any means, but I find that for in-person training, when I am using this, it does help me figure out, okay, the color contrast isn't that great on these slides, or perhaps this particular slide doesn't have a title on it for a screen reader. So it does help me as far as maintaining that a certain level of accessibility in my live in-person training. And Adobe does have an accessibility checker as well. Unfortunately, it is not free like Microsoft is. I wish that it was. I have put in a word to Adobe to tell them that it should be free for something like this, but you can also check your PDFs as well. And then one of the color contrast checkers that I use, in addition to TPGI, thank you, is there is a PowerPoint plugin out there called Bright Carbon. And Bright Carbon is the name of the company, and Bright Slide is the name of the plugin. It actually does have a built-in contrast checker on there if you would like to use it. So that's another tool that I use occasionally. And then I always make sure that if it's an in-person training, that I always use subtitles and translation using PowerPoint. So for those of you who are not aware, you can go to Slideshow and click this little title that says always use subtitles. And you can choose your spoken language. You can choose the subtitle language. It's pretty cool. It supports more than 50 different languages. And thank you for everybody that's putting links in the chat for me. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who use Google Slides, they do not support any other language other than English, but you can also go into the slideshow and enable captions. I usually do this for my in-person trainings because, you know, again, you can use the Microsoft Translator, but with if I don't have live in-person cart services available, I do find that using this is better than nothing. It can be pretty accurate, although I have found that if you are in front of the microphone, so for example, right now I'm in front of my microphone, it picks it up a little bit more accurately. What I have found is that if the microphone is behind you, so for example, if you're in a training room and the microphone for the computer is behind you, it doesn't pick up the PowerPoint captioning as well as it should. So just keep that in mind when you do your in-person trainings. Thank you, Bella. Grackle Docs. I'll have to take a look at that. And then one of the other things that I like to do is I like to use either Microsoft Translator or Google Translate. Again, it's not perfect by any means, but what I like about Microsoft Translator is that it does have a presenter mode where you can make sure that the microphone picks up just you and not necessarily background noise. And it can also mute all others in the conversation. So those are just some of the things that I do before I do any of my in-person training. I do other things as well to make it inclusive. Like I'll check the training date against an interfaith calendar to make sure that it doesn't coincide with any other religious holidays. I try to do that as much as possible if I'm the one organizing the training. Sometimes I don't have that luxury if I'm not the one organizing the training. If there's a nursing mother room available, things like that at the venue itself can be really helpful. And then if there's going to be food available at the event, I try to see if there are any dietary restrictions that need to be taken into account. Again, that's all easier to do if you're the organizer of the event, but I do like to check with organizers before events to make sure that it is as accessible as possible and to find out what I have access to while I'm there. Okay. Now, during training, once you start the training class, I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusive language. Somebody else will be talking about inclusive language a little bit later on in the conference, but I do try to use that as much as possible. I try to use pronouns. So for example, my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and siya, which is a Tagalog pronoun that encompasses both the male and female genders. I like to use a visual description of myself, even when I'm in in-person training, because you don't know if there's somebody in your class who may have a vision impairment or who just may need that. Maybe they're far away back in the back of the room and there's no camera and there's no, all they see are their slides. So again, those are just things that I try to do while I'm inclusive or while I'm trying to train in an in-person class. Yeah. Now, there are some considerations for learner diversity that I do try to take into account when I am designing and delivering in-person training. And those are the sensory disabilities, which are hearing and seeing, mobility issues. So these are people who use wheelchairs or walkers or some kind of mobility device. Non-apparent disabilities, which, like, for example, I have ADHD. There's also dyslexia, autism, anything that is non-apparent when you first look at somebody, and low literacy. So again, the gentleman that I encountered where he couldn't read. Digital literacy can also come into play a little bit in in-person training, especially if you are training a technical class like computer classes. And then we have language and culture. So those are just some of the things that I consider as I'm designing my classes and some of the tools that I try to use. Now, these following slides are not as pretty as they could be, but again, I'm trying to make the slides available afterwards so that you have them. But so here are some of the considerations that I make for people with vision, low vision, or those who may not be able to see at all. Usually what I like to do is, if it's rounds, as much as possible, I'm not a big fan of theater seating for obvious reasons. I don't think any of us are. But as much as possible, if I have pods or tables or round tables, I try to have a section that is reserved for ADA if they choose to use it. So basically have optimized seating. So for example, with the woman who approached me, said she couldn't see, what I ended up doing was I actually put her behind the trainer's computer so that she could see the slides in front of her. And I had her drive the PowerPoint for me. I just pretended that my clicker wasn't working and I had her drive the PowerPoint for me so I could have her save face in her culture, so that she wouldn't have to tell her employer that she couldn't see. So that's just some of the accommodations that I make. I try to use large text and images. For me, in an in-person training room, if I go to the back of the classroom and I can't see what's on the slide, then I need to make it bigger. And the larger the room, the larger the text and the larger the slides. And then obviously, we talked about high contrast colors. And what I mean by text or symbols is that you don't just want to use just colors to differentiate certain things. So for example, you don't want to just differentiate by using green for good and red for wrong. So green for correct and red for wrong. You also want to use text or symbols to indicate that. So for example, you could use a green check mark for correct and a red X for incorrect. Okay. And, one of the things that I like to do as well is I like to use sans serif font, and this also helps with people with cognitive disabilities. So sans serif, for those of you who don't know, are the ones without the squiggly lines below and above the font. It actually helps with readability. And I try to use a minimum 28-point font. Again, the larger the room, the larger the font. And again, there's proper lighting. So sometimes what I notice in classrooms is that PowerPoint can be washed out a little bit. So I will try to dim the lights right in front of the screen, and then everything else I try to keep a little bit lit up. And then as much as possible, if the slide or the image on the slide is key to what you are trying to communicate, then you want to describe what's on that slide. So for example, this is a sensory slide, or a slide about sensory issues. So it's got a picture, a symbol of an eye on it. So things like that. Again, you don't have to describe every single little thing that's on your slides, but if it's something that's a key point to what you're trying to communicate, then you want to describe what's on the slide. And you also, for those people who, we are always taught in our training classes or our train the trainer classes never to read from the slide. I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because there are some people who cannot read what's on the slide for whatever reason. Either they're blind, they have low vision, maybe the lighting isn't that great. I mean, every single time I'm in a training class, I will always see people take out their camera and they'll zoom in if they can't see something. So you do want to kind of keep that in mind. That sometimes if you read a little bit from the slide, it's not so bad, especially if you've got people in your audience who may have low literacy and who are too afraid to tell you that they can't read what's on the slide. Okay. Thank you, Han. I appreciate that. So considerations for hearing, again, the optimized seating, you can use visuals. One of the things that I like to do as far as hearing is concerned is I like to face the front of the audience. So sometimes we make the mistake of when we're writing on a whiteboard or we're writing on a chart paper, we turn around and some of us make the mistake of talking to the wall. Well, for those people who read lips and it helps them, that's really difficult to interpret what you're trying to say. So you want to go ahead and try as much as possible to face the front of the audience and to use that appropriate volume. And again, proper acoustics, microphone and speakers. And then you also want to use either that closed or that open captioning if you have access to it. And then you want to provide transcripts. So one of the things that I do ahead of time is if I'm going to have a video that I play in class, I will actually send out the transcript ahead of time for anybody who needs it. I'll also send out the video so that they can watch it in closed captioning, just so that they can prepare a little bit more, because that actually does help people with cognitive disabilities as well. Okay. So one of the things that is unique to an in-person training is the mobility issues. Now, Bella talked about this in the last session, which is you want to make sure that the classroom is easy to navigate. And that also includes the tables. Sometimes tables are a little bit too high or not high enough for wheelchairs to slip under. So if you can control that at any point, then try to do that. But the most important part is to make sure that there's an easy to navigate pathway for anybody who uses a mobility device. And then again, this is where asking people what they need ahead of time can really come in handy. So giving them, again, a due date to say, what accommodations do you need, can really help in this manner. Okay. And for non-apparent disabilities, what I have found is, yes, thank you, Jeremy. Times New Roman is an example of serif. One of the things that I have found is that I try to make it the instructions simple. Now, I also try to, when you're thinking about incorporating accessibility and inclusion, you also need to think about the activities that you do. So, for example, some activities are a lot very tactile or they're very mobile. And I don't know if any of you have seen this, but there's a video of I think it was a school activity where it was people sitting around or standing in a circle, and they were throwing something around, or they were, kind of linking hands and trying to untangle themselves. Those are all great activities, but if you have mobility issues, if you communicate with your hands, so for example, if you're deaf and you sign with ASL, or if you have vision problems, sometimes those activities are not conducive to being inclusive or accessible. So you always want to think about that as well. And when you're doing activities, you want to make sure that the instructions are simplified, that they're easy to navigate and easy to understand, and that nothing that you do is a surprise. So in other words, no pop quizzes, no, let's do a surprise thing. You want to try to prepare people as much as possible for what it is that they can anticipate, because that also helps lower anxiety for those people who have anxiety disorders. And again, the sans serif font, and mix it up a little bit. So this is not to say that you can't use multiple presentation formats. You still can. You just need to make sure that they're as accessible as possible. And then one of the things that I like to do is, and I'm an independent consultant, so I don't have the ability to do this as much as I would like. But one of the things that I do like to do is I like to ask the organizers, can I record the training so that I can make it available to your participants afterwards? So for those people with non-apparent disabilities, maybe like for myself, if I have ADHD, so when I watch a video, I'm always rewinding and replaying the stuff that I missed because my squirrel brain went somewhere else. So I try to record training for those people who would like to go back and maybe re-see or review something that they may have missed during the training. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So now, low literacy could be considered a disability, but I do like to separate it out just because there are some things that are unique to it. So again, the simplified instructions and the visuals, but what I mean by pure language and using familiar words is that if you have a fancy word and simpler word will suffice, use the simpler word. And you want to use the language that they understand. So the local vernacular, you can use jargon as long as it's their jargon. And then try to make it as interactive as possible. Now, I know I'm going through these slides a little bit quickly. Again, I will make them available to you, but I want to make sure that we have some time to get to questions and answers after or during the presentation. And then with people with low literacy, micro learning works really well. So try to chunk your content into smaller bites for absorption so that they can pick it up a little bit more. And then people with low literacy do really well with concrete examples and recorded training as well. Okay. Now, digital literacy is something that I'm finding is a little bit more prevalent nowadays. Just so you know, only about 35% of the world knows how to use a computer. About 70% of people in the world do not know how to use a computer or mobile devices or any type of technology, or they don't know how to use it well. So when you are using technology in your training, you may need to be prepared to print out hard copies or even hard copies for people with vision impairment who need to have large print. You may need to print those out. Blended learning actually works really well for people with digital literacy issues. And then, if you're going to be using technology ahead of time, I try to tell them what the technology is that I'm going to use. So for example, if I'm going to use Poll Everywhere or one of the other polling softwares, I'm going to send that ahead of time and send out the QR code or send out the link so that they can review it and they can look at any instructions before they come to class. You can also provide how-to job aids, but I find that sending that ahead of time really works very well. Yeah, so that's a really good point, Elizabeth. Trying to build in extra time when you're using technology in class is important because it's going to take people a while to get used to it, especially if it's something that they haven't used before. Now, lastly, during the training, I do have considerations for language learners. We all have people in our classes who speak English as a second, third, or even fourth or fifth language. So trying to use an appropriate reading level, even for those with low literacy, is really important. Just so you know, and I know we have people from the UK and people abroad on this call, but about 7 million people in the UK do not know how to read very well. And 50% of people in the United States read below a 6th grade level. So you want to make sure that you have that appropriate reading level in your materials. What I try to do is I try to use when you review the editor, it always comes up and it says something. It's something called a Flesch-Kincaid reading level. I try to aim for something that's about maybe 6th grade or below if I can avoid any huge techie words or any words that are too advanced or too not familiar for the general audience. So I try to use that appropriate reading level as much as possible. And people with, this goes for pretty much any learner. They do really well with hands-on experiences and real-world application. Again, record the training. And if you don't have access to translators, the translator tools I have found work better than nothing. People are really appreciative of them. Same thing with the captioning. So I do use the PowerPoint subtitles a lot. And if I know that there's going to be another language that a lot of people speak, then I will use that. So it is, for me, better than nothing. It's not perfect by any means. I know that some people laugh at the grammar and things like that, but I have found that it helps me bridge that gap with people who need it. So those are all things that I like to do during training. So again, before training, you prepare all the things that you want to use ahead of time. And then during training, these are just some of the things that I like to do to keep that in mind as I'm going through it. And then after training, couple of things that you can do here is I try to compile and distribute any notes that are taken on whiteboards or chart paper, or I'll take pictures of it and I'll try to compile them into a single document and send them out. I will send a transcript of the recording if I can. And then it's really important if you have other people in the room with you. So for example, say an AV person or an interpreter or a facilitator, if you're going to do this training again, you want to debrief with them to say, okay, what worked? What didn't work? What do we need for next time, etc. And then also in my evaluations and my level 1 evaluations, I try to incorporate feedback from the participants. So I will ask them, was this accessible for you? Did this work for you? Is there something else that we can add to this to help you in the future? So those are just some of the things that I like to do after training is over. Now, some of the things, other things that I try to incorporate is I try not to use too much animation in my slides because that can really trigger people with seizure disorders. So I do not use GIFs in my training because that can actually trigger migraines with some people. So I try not to use that as well. So just little things that I've picked up over the years of things that I try to take into account when I'm actually going through a training class. Okay, so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause and look at some of the questions and answers, questions, and see if I can answer them. And then I will ask you what you think. Oh, yes. So the name of the certificate exam, it is the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And it is called the what is it? It's called the core. There's several different accessibility certifications that they have, but the main one is the core one. So it's called Core Practices of Accessibility certification, I think is what it is. Okay, and then one of the other things that I also like to do, Leah, is as far as accessibility and inclusion is concerned, is I actually like universal design for learning. I'm a big proponent of that. So if you go to cast.org, which I will put in the chat, that is the organization who developed Universal Design for Learning, and they do have certifications available as well. Yeah. Okay. So that I will kind of go for that. Thank you, Belle. Okay. Are there certain things you include for accessibility inclusion for every training, regardless of other accommodation needs? Yes, Elizabeth, I actually will by default use the PowerPoint captioning or Google Slides captioning unless I have cart services available to me. Or unless the organizer tells me please don't use it for whatever reason. Sometimes because the thing is about the PowerPoint and the Google Slides subtitles or the captioning is that you need to have a plugin on PowerPoint and Google Slides in order to use it. Actually, I don't think you need it on Google Slides, but you do need it for PowerPoint. And so if I'm unable to use my own laptop, like for example, they insist that I use a a USB drive on their own laptop, then I will not use it. But by default, I try to use it as much as possible. And the reason why, even though I don't know if somebody is going to be needing that or not, the reason why I try to make that my default is because I have had people come up to me in training classes and say, you're the first person who's used that, and I'm actually hard of hearing, and I haven't told my boss, and I really appreciate you using that. So that is a default that I use. One of the other defaults that I use is the color contrast checkers that other people use. Try to use as many symbols as I can. And I also don't use, I try to use inclusive language as much as possible. So for example, unless I know that the population prefers identity first language. So there's person first language means you put the person before the disability, right? So person who uses a wheelchair, person who is deaf, person who is blind. However, there are some people in the disability community who prefer to use identity first language, which means that they put the disability before their disability is part of their identity. So for example, the autistic community prefers identity first language. The deaf community prefers identity first language. So, but I default to person first language if I'm not sure. And if I'm corrected, then I apologize, I correct myself, and then I move on. So those are just some of the things that I do. I hope that answers your question. Okay. And then Tala. Curious to know the correlations between accessibility and rigor, and if rigor is something we should consider as accessibility standards grow in adoption. And I do see that there is a comment here. Yeah, so one of the accessibility standards is robust, which means that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give up on rigor. But again, it depends on who your audience is, right? And what your learning objectives are. So for example, if you have a compliance or a safety training and your goal is to make sure that people are safe, that they go home at the end of every day, the rigor needs to be there in terms of what they are doing and not necessarily what they are reading, if that makes sense. Whereas if you are training a class that is on presentation skills or readability or business writing, things like that, then the rigor could be in what they are reading. So I hope that makes sense. Okay. All right. So those are some of the things that I do before, during, and after training. I'd like to ask you at this point, what, and keep the questions coming if you can, but what is something that we talked about that you either want to try or something that you are going to take away with you? And I just charted subtitles, sorry. So you can see there is a way to turn it on and off in the PowerPoint as well. Where's my arrow key? Okay. So what is one thing that you will do differently when delivering in-person training? What's your biggest takeaway? What other questions do you have for me? I'd like to open it up to the floor and any other comments or feedback that you all have. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Heather. And the needs analysis phase. Thank you, Erica. Yeah. Translations. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes, one of the things, thank you for saying the proximity to the speaker, Amy, because one of the things that I also notice is that a lot of people will just get up on stage and they'll say, well, I know this is a large room, and but I'm not going to use the microphone because I talk loud. I'm not a big fan of that because people will need the microphone if they have a hearing, if they have hearing loss or they're hard of hearing. So I'm wondering what you would do. Sorry, the chat's going really fast. So what you would do differently if wearing a mask while delivering in-person training. So that's actually a really great point, Bella. I actually have, let me see if I can find it. I actually have one of these little things, which I haven't used in a while because most people don't wear masks anymore. But I actually have one of these. And this is actually a mask that fits over your face and it actually allows you to see lips. Now, the only problem is that it does fog up. So I have to use anti-fogging, the anti-fogging thing to make sure that it doesn't fog up too much as I'm speaking. But I don't wear lipstick while I'm wearing it either because that makes a mess. But I have used this during my in-person trainings when we were still under a mask mandate. So I have found that that has been helpful. Hi, Wendy. Okay. All right. What other questions are there? Are there any in the chat, Louis, that I may have missed?
Not seeing any. You are getting a lot of thank yous. And Gwen, you're a heck of a trainer. A lot of what you shared with us today is just amazing stuff. I actually am taking notes myself because as somebody who likes, hopefully going to produce conferences at some point again, a lot of this applies for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And and again, it's everything from dietary restrictions to being inclusive of, and I focus specifically on accessibility in this particular piece, but being inclusive of as many people as possible, taking that all into account really does make for a better learning experience. And one of the things too that I have heard is when we're going back to in-person conferences, there really should be a virtual option available. So trying to make that conference hybrid as much as possible makes it a little bit more accessible because some people cannot leave their homes. So
Yeah, no, definitely. I totally agree. Totally agree. The ones that we've put on previously in the past, we actually did record everything and offer it to everyone as well. It's a whole separate technology challenge, but I do think that it's necessary.
yeah. Okay, it looks like we have some more questions in the question and answer, so I'm going to answer them. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here real quick. Actually, before I do that, this is my contact information. If you scan that QR code on the left, you will be directed directly to my website, which has some accessibility and UDL resources on it. I will be adding some more. I'll add this PowerPoint on there as well, Louis, for you on that web page. And then feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect with people, offline and continue the conversation. And I'll put my LinkedIn link in the chat as well. So back to questions. I'm going to stop sharing here. All right, Q&A. Answer. Any suggestions for enhancing my newsletter to teachers? Include videos, links, amount of information. Yeah, that's a really great question, Erica. I am a bigger fan of shorter newsletters than anything, either a little bit of a longer newsletter once in a while, as opposed to, or shorter newsletters a little bit more frequently is what I've heard can encourage people to read a little bit more. You can include videos and links. If you do include a video, make sure that you are making captioning available or a transcript available, and also make sure that the video has audio descriptions. So for example, audio descriptions for that are audio descriptions are those that actually describe what's happening in the video as it goes along. Courtney, great question. So the subtitles in PowerPoint or Google Slides, that is for real-time presenting. So I usually turn that on. You can use it for pre-recorded presentations as well. So you can turn it on and then record, but I actually use it in my live in-person training. And yes, I would recommend that the facilitator use a microphone. Again, one of the things that I have found is that I have found that if I have a microphone, if it's not directly connected to the computer, then it doesn't pick up the captioning or my voice as well. I have to be in front of the microphone on the computer, whatever the computer is picking up, in order for me to have accurate subtitles. But that's something that you would need to work out with the organizers of the event. Because sometimes, like for example, I presented at a conference in May and the audio was going somewhere else, but I still had the captioning on and the microphone from the computer was picking it up and it was behind me and it was not picking up what my microphone was picking up. So the captioning was absolutely horrible. And so that's when I realized, oh, I really need to make sure that I am in a proximity to the computer or whatever microphone the computer is using in order for the captioning to come up accurately. Yes, okay. And then let's see. Would sending a pre-participation survey be helpful? Yes. Thank you, Anna Marie, for that question. Yes, a pre-participation survey would be helpful to figure out what accommodations prior to the event. What I usually do is I say, and I do this for a number of different things. If I'm going to have food, I ask for dietary restrictions. If I am going to do any type, I just usually have a simple thing that says, if you need accommodations for this training, please let me know by this date so that I can arrange for them for you. So that allows people, and sometimes people have like a checklist, like they'll say, do you need an ASL interpreter? Do you need cart services? I don't do that for a number of reasons. One is that I don't want to put people on the spot and having to have them disclose to me what they need, what they have, what their disability is, other than what they need, if that makes any sense. The other reason is that I happen to be an independent consultant, and so I have limited resources. So if I don't, it's not that I don't like to offer ASL and cart services at every training. I wish I could. It's just that I cannot afford to. So I usually leave that open-ended so that if people need ASL or they need cart services, they'll know, they'll tell you. And you can arrange for them at that time. But just for me and my wallet, unfortunately, at this time, I can't afford to just blanket out say I can offer ASL or in-cart service or cart services for you. That's a really good question. If you record your slide narrations in advance, it won't auto caption those on playback. Huh. Yeah, I think, Andrea, you can record your slide narrations in advance, but I think what we're talking about is the actual subtitles. So I can actually show you what that looks like in PowerPoint. I'm just going to share my screen again. So I can actually turn on. So I've been able to do this before, which is I've been able to use the PowerPoint captioning, and I've been able to record my training virtually as well as in person using this. It depends upon what recording software you have, but it does pick up the captioning. Slide narrations, I think, is a little bit of a different thing. So that's a really good point. Thank you. Okay, we have about 6 minutes left. Are there any other questions or comments in the chat that I'm missing?
I'm not seeing any. Just double checking here. Yeah, looks like all Q&A has been answered. Yeah, I think you're good.
Okay. So again, I'll make the slides available on my website, and you can download them from there. Give me about a day or two to put them up, because it is a little early here in Hawaii. But yeah, just give me a day or two to put them up, and then I will make sure that they are up for you.
Awesome. Do you want to? Did everyone get Gwen's contact information? Okay. I don't know if that's something you can flash up again on the
Yeah,
screen.
let me flash it up again.
And earlier, I was trying to convince Gwen that maybe at some point we could do a TLDC meetup in Oahu.
Yes,
somehow.
in Hawaii. There's a convention center. There's a convention center. All right, let me pop up my contact information again.
Good.
There you go.
All right. All right, everyone. Well, thanks everyone again for being here and supporting the event. Really appreciate it. We do have another session coming up at 12 Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern. I don't know if you noticed, but with the schedule, I do like to put like breaks in between, like an hour break, sometimes even longer, just because I know for myself and for others that I've talked to, having that ability to reflect on what you just learned, gather your notes, and be able to kind of sit with it for a little bit is really invaluable. So hopefully that's something that you enjoy and it's useful to you. But we'll be getting back together in about an hour. We'll be talking to Chris Paxton McMillan. Steps you can do to make your courses inclusive and accessible. Chris is a longtime L&D veteran. She's been in the space for over 30 years, and she's absolutely fantastic. Has done pretty much everything there is to do in L&D, and I think that it'll be a fantastic presentation to end the day. So hopefully we'll see you there. And I see a salamat, Gwen. So yeah, another Filipino here. But
Yay!
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the session, and hopefully we'll see all of you in the next one soon. I don't know if there are going to be any tables going, but if you want me to create one, or if there is anybody speaking at any of the tables in the lounge, feel free to just jump in, and that's a lot of fun too, just to have some chat time with other attendees.
Yeah,
All right.
I can jump in on a table in about 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll go ahead and I'll create a couple more and get that there for you. All right.
Okay,
And thanks again,
sounds
Gwen.
good.
Really appreciate it. All right.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everybody.
Luis. Bye, everybody. Thank you.